I also want to say a little bit about the two books that I chose to use for this course, and why I chose them. Out of all of the thousands and thousands and thousands of books that are out there, why these two? Excellent questions. So, I chose the two. One is this book here called 5 Minds for the Future by Howard Gardner. I read it because I figured probably a lot of you will not have read this book, and it's really, really interesting stuff. Howard Gardner is a legendary figure in this field of education. He's a Harvard professor, and he's the guy that invented the idea of multiple intelligences, which we'll talk about a bit later here at some point. But that's not the only, he's sort of known as Mr. Multiple Intelligence, Mr. MI, but actually, I mean, he probably goes around and says, I am not just the multiple intelligences guy on his t-shirt. Because he actually has done lots of other work on lots of other subjects. And so this is one of his more recent books, 5 Minds for the Future. And the reason I chose it is that it puts the conversation we have about teaching and learning in a much bigger context of the kind of social context and the wider realities of the world that we live in. And so I think it's just helpful to remind us, why are we doing this sort of exercise? Why does this matter? Let me give you a little snapshot. So those of you who are doing the course for credit, you need to read this. Strategic learning as you may be. So, but those of you who aren't necessarily, it is something I'd really commend for you to read. So let me tell you what he's talking about in terms of these 5 minds. What he's talking about is what he calls discipline. In the future, individuals who wish to thrive will need to be experts in at least one area. They will need a discipline. In other words, they will need significant learning and knowledge in at least one area of life, right? Secondly, it's the synthesizing mind. So as synthesizers, they will need to be able to gather together information from disparate sources and put it together in ways that work for themselves and can be communicated to other persons. So there's a knowledge, right? This knowledge and discipline thing. The second one is synthesis. The ability to be a synthesizer, take lots of information, right? We live in an information overload society, and it's only going to accelerate further. Are you going to be able to gather together information from sources and put it together in a way that makes sense to you and to others? Third one, because almost anything that can be formulated as rules will be done well by computers, rewards will go to creators. Those who have constructed a box but can think outside of it. So he talks about creativity and a creative mind, right? And the essential nature of the way that the world works and the economy works, that we have people who have a capacity for creativity. Third one, very interesting. The world of today and tomorrow is becoming increasingly diverse, and there is no way to cordon oneself off from this diversity. Accordingly, we must respect those who differ from us, as well as those with whom we have similarities. This is what he calls the respectful mind. It's about relationship and the capacity for the appreciation of diversity. Right? You live in a very diverse society in Singapore, right? This has got to be a value. The last one, interestingly, and given my sort of professional field in ethics, finally, as workers and as citizens, we need to be able to act ethically, to think beyond our own self-interest, and to do what is right under the circumstances. That's what he calls the ethical mind. Right? And his definition there is really very interesting to me. He talks about the ability to think beyond our own self-interest. So in a sense, the moral problem that he's got his finger on is selfishness, self-centeredness, taking advantage of your situation, promoting yourself or your own group at the expense of others. That is a deep, deep biblical insight, right? The deep biblical insight is that is the definition of sin. Right? So he's trying to talk about a way. He's not a Christian. This is not a theological book, but he actually has got a diagnosis of what's going wrong in human nature and what's going wrong in our world built into it that actually makes a lot of sense to me. So his ethical mind here, I'm cheering for. Right? If it is a way to, so what he's thinking about is those 5 minds. How are we going to educate people? How are people going to learn and grow towards those 5 minds, right? Those 5 minds intersect with one another in a way he spells out as the book goes on. So the sense of the disciplined mind, the synthesizing mind, what was the third one? The creative mind, yes, right. The respectful mind and this ethical mind, right? So my interest is, in light of what we're talking about in this class and everything that all of this represents, how do you shape and transform people to be those kinds of people, to have that kind of mind, right? And ideally what he wants is people that have all of those 5 minds cultivated in their own life. Right? So it's a very lofty sort of vision. He's pressing it as this is what the world needs, right? And the question then is, what does education looks like? What would education look like if we were geared around forming those minds? Right? Very, very interesting questions. Okay? So Gardner is valuable from that standpoint. So it's a bit more philosophical, but it also is a connect the dots kind of exercise between what we're doing in our days together and this bigger overall social, cultural framework.